hello everyone. I'm Anthony Bertelli. My two positions are as the Sherwin Whitmore Professor of Public Policy, Law, and Political Science at Penn State University, and as a Senior Research Fellow here at IBEI. It's interesting to think about the values of democratic governance in the European Union, which my collaborators and I on the ERC-funded project that we're working on here at IBEI have been theorizing. It's interesting to think about them as a collective, not as individual principles. The key principle is the rule of law. And our argument and drawing that argument from European Union law, treaties, founding documents, but both hard and soft law in the European Union. Our argument there is that this notion of the rule of law is a substantive as well as a procedural one. So it's not enough to be formally applying the law, to stick to the letter of the law when administrative agencies do their business. It's also important to serve certain ideas of justice that are built into those treaties and things as well. So if the rule of law is the kind of cornerstone of all this, a series of values help public administration and help the process of governance, if you will, meet that objective. They are accountability to democratically elected politicians. Their efficiency is important to democracy because we have scarce resources and it's difficult to do everything that the public wants with waste of resources. They include impartiality. Impartiality too has a sort of substantive and procedural side. So for instance, a scholarship program that's based entirely on test scores or numerical evidence of scholarly achievement might be procedurally impartial, but the reasons why different groups of people come to do better or worse in the aggregate on those test scores is also something that has to be considered. There's transparency. Transparency is fundamental to democracy, of course, because it's important for the people to be able to know what is being done in their name by public administration, by the institutions of governance. And so transparency informs the democratic process. And it's important not to think about these principles in isolation, as I've mentioned. And the final principle that is fundamental is what we've called systemic integrity. So administrators, anybody involved in building the institutions of governance or in operating them, simply can't pick and choose from among the principles that I've talked about before. And this notion of systemic integrity suggests that all of those principles, is indeed in the nature of principles, have to be present as they do their business. So efficiency is traded off against accountability or transparency. It's not eliminated. It's not removed from consideration. Public officials are guided by values in practice, and the notion of being guided is actually very important to the equation, because what public officials do is exercise discretion. There's an old law school exercise. No rule covers all potential situations. A rule like no vehicles in the park always means that there's the possibility of discretionary interpretation. Is a bicycle a vehicle, so on and so forth. So given this kind of discretion, which is inevitable in public administration, the guidance from these principles is crucial in thinking about how that discretionary action is applied. So as a threshold concern, discretion is always present. So guidance itself is an important thing to understand, and to understand that it does apply. In the way that this guidance happens is, we think, through a couple of mechanisms. So one is a formal set of mechanisms that work through the law. There are certain things that are reviewable in any kind of decision making that public administration does. So there's the stick of enforcement. But there's also the importance of these values to individuals. Individuals seem to, and I'll talk about this in a moment, but individuals seem to share these values. And our evidence suggests that there's sort of broad consensus for the importance of these kinds of values, whether or not you're in public service. So we could think about public officials as simply citizens with a little bit more training. And to the extent that they bring with them values that they hold as citizens, that training need not, and we might hypothesize, should not reconfigure their values about how governance or how the state itself should operate. And we find evidence that they do not. The public do share the values of democratic governance. And that statement is based so far on our research, and we'll do more. At this point, we've done surveys in the US, in the UK, and in Italy. And these surveys include a number of attitudes about political and social life, a number of attitudes about important values, moral values, things that are foundational to who we are and how we think about our relations with other people. So these attitudes about politics, policies, political institutions, but also values, these orientations toward the values of social and political and moral life, constitute what social psychologists and political psychologists call a belief system. And we think, which follows an increasingly common line of methodological thinking, that one can represent a belief system as a sort of network of these attitudes. So a network in the sense that each attitude is a node and they're correlated with each other. And the correlations form the edges in this network. So in those terms, we can think not just about the correlations, but we can also think about the structure of the overall belief system. The belief system is structured into communities, and the governance values that I mentioned before, attitudes toward those governance values form their own community. And that community has some important and special properties. It is highly interdependent, so the connections among those values, the correlations among those values, are stronger than correlations between those values and anything else in the belief system. And they're quite impervious to change. Even changes in very fundamental values, like the way that you think about fairness, have a very low probability of changing the structure of beliefs about the state. So for that reason, we think we have a very strong case for saying that these values are important, that they're important to individuals. And one final thing that we find, one can think about a public official as simply a citizen with a little bit more training. And so when we compare these belief systems among people who have served as public officials, who have had that little bit of training, to those in the general population, we find virtually no differences. So we do think that these are shared, and they form a particularly interesting and important part of social and political belief systems. So it's tempting to think about this era of political polarization, of populist insurgency, and even the notion of what populism is, whether populism is the kind of thing that is fundamentally democratic or it's something that is fundamentally undemocratic. I mean, there are lots of ways in which political theorists, political scientists, and other observers think about these kinds of questions. That being said, in this era, what is the role of public administration in maintaining democracy? And you won't be surprised to hear me say that the role of public administration is to maintain those values. It's to maintain those values so that the rule of law is maintained and that the structural integrity of the state is something that makes it hard for individual politicians to shift in ways that violate the notion of democracy. So one way of understanding this is that suppose a politician has a particular interest and wants a particular public official to perform a task that meets that interest. I'm sure you have a lot of those kinds of ideas in your mind, so anyone that you have will do. At that point, the question, the sort of normative question is, can that public official act responsibly and still do precisely what the politician wants, right? So that would suggest that accountability, for instance, is everything. That simply following what the politician wants to do is all that has to be done. And that's a perilous way of thinking for a couple of reasons that I've already talked about. One is that the integrity of the state means that we can't focus simply on accountability to the exclusion of all of the other principles. That would give us problems with the rule of law. And in some of the cases that might be in your head, you might be thinking about particular problems of the rule of law. And I think that's the way this system works. And it shows just how important the integrity of the state is in preserving democratic values, because that integrity is what keeps the rule of law intact. And the rule of law is fundamental to democratic values. So a lot of the ideas that I've talked about are inspired by a book that I wrote for Cambridge University Press in, it's now 2021 it was. It was called Democracy Administered, and the title gives you a sense of why I've been thinking about things in the way that I've described here. That if public administration can somehow adhere to these values, then it can become a sort of way of administering democracy itself. And that the goal of public administration in democratic societies would itself be, and the argument is fairly strong in the title, democracy administered. So thank you for listening.